Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ and thank you all very much for joining us today. So, Orks, greenskins, the War Boys as they're known. I'm finally doing a video all about the Orks. Yes, greenskin lovers, this one's specifically for you. And as always for you, Peter and Callum and Michaela and Tio and Tim and all the rest of you guys who join me every time. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate you all. Anyway, so we're doing it all about the Orks today. And this is partly to do with the announcement of the new Snagger Boys in Warhammer Fest quite recently. And it's just kind of a little retrospective of how Orks have changed over the years and what they're like now compared to how they used to be and what they are doing these days. So, naturally, since we're talking about the Orks, we should be painting an Orc Nob or Noble himself. Indeed. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Orcs have been one of the oldest races that Games Workshop have had, being both in 40k fantasy and, of course, Middle-earth, although they're slightly different orcs, but anyway. They've had a very long history in that time as well, albeit one which is a bit shallower than some of their contemporaries. For in 40k, for example, if you wanted a race that was the literal epitome of the there is only war concept, then you can't go much further than the Orcs. Their entire mentality has always very much been live to fight, not fight to live, unlike a lot of the other races. This has obviously left them with a bit less depth than a lot of the other cat races out there, but that's not necessarily a bad thing if you just want to pick up and play and have a good time. Whereas if you're playing with things like Eldar or even humanity, either in Imperium or Chaos form, there's a bit more depth that you have to go into in order to understand entirely the races. But obviously the Orcs have always also had that connection to the Old Ones, a race that predates all the other races in 40k, which has always given them a bit of a mystical past, even though it's never been fully explored. And then of course there's a very unique aesthetic they've had in both fantasy and 40k. The ramshackle junky look of their equipment, their vehicles and everything else has given them a really unique and distinctive look when they're lined up among their contemporaries. I mean, on the one hand it is almost humorous to see just how ramshackle and how thrown together everything looks, but on the other hand it's quite dangerous and quite lethal looking when you give it a second look, which weirdly enough grounds them quite well in the universe of the Grimdark. And even though the Grimdark's aesthetic overall has changed a little bit over the years, the consistency with the Orcs has been quite interesting, whereas everything else has had slight alterations, albeit quite subtly over the years, but they've stayed relatively consistent this entire time. But all that's just to say that the Orcs have had quite a long history where they have had subtle changes, but they've remained consistent in a lot of areas. So all of this is to give us an overview as to how the Orcs have been consistent over the past 20-30 years of their existence in the games of Games Workshop. But what we need to do to start seeing the evolution really come into effect is go back about 20 years to 2001 and start off from the era of 3rd into 4th edition. In 2001, the Orcs were a very different race to how they are now. Their range is far more limited, but they were still very good in the game. Now, whilst you could argue that most armies back then that weren't Space Marines had a very limited range, and this is true, for the Orcs this actually worked in their favour in a way. Now, with Orcs, one of the big things that you were encouraged to do was to kit bash, to convert, and even to build your own vehicles and do the same to your units. So they would be equipped with many different varieties of weapons and many different bits of equipment from across all the other ranges. You have to remember that this was back in a time where most people were converting their models anyway, so the majority of most metal models especially were largely just used as a base, and you'd buy that and then out would come the green stuff and plastic art and you'd just start converting away. And the Orcs really were one of the front runners in this area, especially when you see things like regular Orc boys running around with weapons such as Tau fusion guns or vehicles that be converted from Eldar anti-grav tanks or even Necron Gauss weapons on the sides of Orc vehicles. You really did get the sense that this was an army that you could very much fit to please whatever conversion fantasies that you liked. And obviously this also meant that in a lot of ways you get some very distinctive and unique armies depending on which players you were playing with. Now, I'm not saying that the current Orc range is bad by any stretch of the imagination. I think those models are beautifully made and are fantastic. However, you don't necessarily see armies in the same way as you used to do back then, where every player, especially for Orcs, was very much encouraged to build up their own army more from scratch than anything else. But the one thing which did bring them all together was a distinctly ramshackle and distinctly thrown together look that you simply didn't see across any of the other races in either 40k or fantasy. And in some respects this aesthetic was slightly more distinctive for Orcs on their own, and even the model range was extremely old by those standards, you have to remember, by 2001. And this is one of the downsides to this, unfortunately. A lot of the Orcs range was so old that they were still using models from the 1980s, and even in their codex, which lasted until 2008. There were pictures in there from 1996 and pictures in there from 1987 of models and even conversions that had very much come from many, many years ago. And even came from almost a decade before the time of the publication of that codex. Now, I know that in a lot of their older codexes, Games Workshop would put more conversions in there, very much to inspire the players to make their own models, which is something which they don't do as much these days. But it was always interesting just to think that that was largely the point, to inspire people to create their own stuff, rather than simply to give them a full roster of models that they had created. I understand that obviously the way things work now is very different to how they were back then, but this is part of the history, so it's worth mentioning nonetheless. But ultimately, this is just to set us up where the Orks were before we started to see the real changes. But the thing I want to make very clear is that in-game they were considered a very strong army. They were virtually fearless, as in they could almost never run off the board, for those of you who aren't sure what that is. A lot of their vehicles were so strangely worded in their rules that when they did explode, there was virtually no damage done to the army. They were always bad at shooting, but that wasn't the point. You were almost always rolling more dice than a lot of other armies, and even to this day, which if we jump ahead a little bit, Orks a well put together shooting Ork army can still put out more shots than a Tau or an Imperial Guard army, and that's food for thought as we go forward. But obviously for Orks, a lot of things definitely changed in 2007, when the 4th edition Ork Codex came around. And obviously this coincides a year later with the release of Black Reach. Now, you have to remember, in that 1 year period, most of the Ork range was completely changed. Even though there were still predominantly metal models across the range, there were far more plastic models in. So there was a new set of frames for Ork boys that included a plastic knob, which was quite useful. There were also things, and I should clarify that Ork knob means Ork noble, so you can all stop giggling right now. But on top of that, you would also have things such as plastic war bosses in the Black Reach box, along with plastic death dreads. Then there was also the reinvention of looters, a new war truck, and a bunch of other characters that were largely in metal. So this was things such as the Pain Boy, which came a little bit later on, I believe, but also followed up by new tank busters, and a couple of years later the Ork battle wagon, which was quite a large vehicle. And as a side note, I wasn't a big fan of the battle wagon at first, but it definitely grew on me over time. And then if we continue to move forward, the Orks got more and more new weapons and more new kits. So they had a new Weird Boy, which is their Psyker, and eventually they got plastic Storm Boys, plastic bikes, and a multi-part kit of plastic Ork knobs or nobles, or whatever you want to call them. I'm not going to keep saying it over and over again. And eventually they got a Dakka Jet. And then if we think around about the 2009-2010 time, the Orks were, after all, the second race to get a plastic super heavy after the Imperial Guard in the form of the Ork Stomper, which, to be fair, still looks pretty good nearly 11 years later on. And the only other army in that time that really rivals the massive plastic re-releases to the Orks was the Drukhari that came along in 2010 and have continued to release plastic kits as the years have gone by. But that's just what the release is. Did the aesthetic change? If anything, the Games Workshop could have completely changed the aesthetic of the Ork, and as they have done in some ways with some other armies. But what they did with Orks instead is make them look far more ramshackle, make them look even more junky, make all their weapons and equipment look even more like it's about to fall apart at any minute. And because they leaned into that, I think they very much helped give the Orks an even stronger identity. Now, the ramshackle look always worked for Orks, but to really achieve it, you definitely had to make your own vehicles. If we think back to how the Orks looked in those earlier years, pre-2001, their vehicles in many cases did actually look quite clean, and some of them were really rather small as well. Now, I don't blame Games Workshop for that was just the limitations of the technology. But even the contemporary war truck is nearly twice the size of the old war truck, and both their bikes and things such as the Dakka Trike are absolutely enormous compared to their predecessors. But what it's worth remembering now as well is that Orks were one of those armies in gameplay terms which really did benefit from all those new releases and their new codex. They've always had a far more broad approach to the game than most people give them credit for. A lot of people simply see them as a horde army that's dedicated to close combat, similar to how people see Tyranids. But like Tyranids, the Orks aren't necessarily just at combat. They do have some very powerful shooting weapons. And even though people dispute this, you have to remember that you can take a unit of 10 to 15 Ork boys with rocket launchers, but that's still more rocket launchers than a tactical squad or a devastator squad's going to put out at once. And the other thing to bear in mind is that because they're rolling more dice, if the luck's even remotely on your side, you're going to do a lot of damage anyway. But that's just playstyle and metrics of gaming. That's not really how they've evolved as models over the years. But how they have evolved rules-wise over the years is in this point, this is when the reintroduction of the Weird Boy gave them more psychic powers. It gave them more unique vehicle loadouts. It gave them more in terms of how you can use Orc Boys, whether you want to take smaller or larger units of them, and their benefits were quite different depending on where you took them. So to summarise, 2007 to 2011 probably were the biggest transformation for Orcs that made them look more like the Orcs that we're familiar with today. And even though this period did end 10 years ago, arguably without it, you could say that we'd be using a very different Orc army to the one we have today. And also this was the era that vastly expanded on the number of special characters that the Orcs actually have models for. Before then it really was just Grotsnik and Ghazghkull, and you have to remember that back then Games Workshop would occasionally put special characters into codexes but wouldn't necessarily give them models to match. But Ghazghkull and Mad Dot Grotsnik are the only two from that era that actually had models. But now in 2007 onwards we started to see things like Zagstruck, Snickrot, and of course Badruk, who did, at least to be fair to him, have a model way back in the day. But ultimately what this all leads us to is there was more personality going into the Orc Codex that we had seen previously to that. And it seemed like at the end of 2011 they were riding a massive high and they were going to do quite well going forward. However, this unfortunately was not necessarily going to last. And this brings me on to a bit of a decline that the Orcs suffered. When 6th edition rolled around for the Orcs, their codex took a lot of the colour out of it, I think it's fair to say. They definitely lost their competitive edge in the minds of a lot of people, and they lost a lot of the unique rules and charm that they had in their previous codex. And as a side note, I remember reading the newer codex, the 6th edition codex, and thinking a lot of the jokes and a lot of the humour have been taken out of this for some reason. You have to remember that the Orc codex was, in some respects, more light-hearted codex than a lot of the other ones. Now, you could put this down to people seeing the Orcs as the comedy race of 40k, even though they arguably kind of were, but obviously that's only because there hadn't been a massive amount of serious exploration done to them. But they took it in their stride, and it worked out quite well for them for a really long time. They were never as serious as things like Eldar or Space Marines or the Adeptus Sororitas or the Grey Knights. They were always a bit more of a light-hearted, more fun option to play with, and I think that's one of the big draws to them even to this day. But this codex took a lot of that out, and it made them seem like they were a more serious menace than they necessarily had always been. So the fact that the Orcs themselves have fun fighting rather than seeing it as this big honourable tradition was something which made their codexes quite interesting, but a lot of that seemed to change more towards the honourable tradition side of things that you can easily find in just about any other 40k race. So that was a bit of a shame, but ultimately that's a tangent. You have to remember that this was the new codex era, so codexes tend to come with new models. Well, they did back then anyway, and obviously new codexes mean new models, means hype. But unfortunately, a lot of those newer models that came out didn't necessarily live up to the hype of the massive release of the previous years. So obviously by this point they had the Dakajet, they had the Stomper, they had a large number of plastic kits. And this time we saw the Gorkanaut and the Morkanaut come around, and another new plastic war boss. Now, I'm not saying they're bad models, they're always quite nice, but ultimately there were still a few gaps in the Orc roster from even older kits that hadn't been filled. Deathcopters, for example, are still a fundamentally ancient kit, and the ones from Blackreach have never been re-released, along with things like the old War Buggy and the War Track, which a few years later did get new models for, and their new model is lovely, as everyone will always point out. But ultimately this was the point where I think, and a lot of other Orc players at the time, felt that needed to happen. And the other thing which was a bit of a shame about this period for Orcs is because they lost so much of the charm, and the universal special rules roster around this time grew to be immense. So even for Orcs, it meant that they were largely pulling from the same pile of special rules that all the other armies have. But the Orcs have never really rubbed up against the universal special rules particularly well. And the reason they haven't is because ultimately they do play really rather differently to a lot of the other races in 40k, who all have enough similarities that they could have previously gotten away with having largely the same set of rules, with even if it is with only a slightly minor tweak. Now, that didn't work for the Orcs, firstly because they were a very different army on a fundamental level, but ultimately with the universal special rules and some of the changes in the weapon system, that really went out the window for Orcs, and I do believe that to this day most people say that it hurt them. And obviously that's just what happened when their codex was released in 6th edition. And the thing which probably left them in a state of decline for a while is they didn't seriously get anything else for a really long time after this, because ultimately this was the time when Games Workshop was focusing on a lot of other things. The end times for fantasy going into Age of Sigmar, the Horus Heresy game came into its own for Forge World, and then eventually we had the plastic releases in Games Workshop in general, along with things like Imperial Knights, Custodes, Mechanicus, Harlequins getting their own codex. There was a lot going on in Games Workshop's other areas, and the Orcs unfortunately just weren't a priority. Now, if any of you are Eldar players out there, I know, you guys have been waiting for new models for basically forever. but unfortunately this is not that story, and I do believe you'll get your own models eventually. Anyway, moving on. But there was one very small thing which did happen during this period, and that was the Beast Arises series. Now, aside from a handful of novels about the Armageddon crisis, or the Third War for Armageddon, the Orks had never really taken centre stage on any of the major famous campaigns that took place within the 40k universe. But then we get the roots to Armageddon. In the Beast Arises series, they do give us this enormous scale orc invasion, and we see orcs being more than just brutal, monstrous killing machines up front and nothing else. They're cunning, they're clever, they're swift, they're resourceful, they know how to use what resources they have at their disposal, and also know how to outsmart and outwit their opponents. It was a really strong series that had a lot going for it. But the other thing it did is it also gave us a bit more background into the Orks as a whole, and told us the story about how Ullanor, the famous world from the Horus Heresy series, was actually the home planet of the Orks themselves. And that was quite an interesting insight into perhaps one of the reasons why Orks seem to have, from the perspective of the Imperium at least, an only war mindset. The idea of losing your home planet to an invading force is something which probably would strike a chord with many, many people, and giving that insight into why the Orks do what they do with a little bit more depth and a bit more nuance was quite good for them. It's just a shame it came at a point where they were certainly at their lowest level of popularity, but ultimately that's just where they were. So obviously with this one nugget of good news surrounded with so much negativity that had come with the Orks for the past 5 years or so at this point, it was hard to see where the future lay for them. But then obviously 8th and 9th came along and everything changed for everyone again. Now, obviously, when 8th and 9th edition dropped, everyone was very uncertain as to what it would mean for all of their armies, but nonetheless, Orks definitely were one of the big question mark armies. However, I think, if, as I say in my 8th and 9th edition and my opinion video on that one, is that I believe that the changes ultimately benefited the Orks more immediately than a lot of people realised. Now, before we had 8th and 9th edition, 40k had a lot of limitations from every edition from 3rd to 7th, which meant that there were a lot of things you couldn't do in game. And some of those limitations, I do believe, probably hurt armies such as Orks the most. But they'd always been able to overcome them with their own universal with their own special rules. But by 6th edition, most of those special rules were gone, and they were in a position where they were weakened because they were stuck with the limitations that were generally ascribed to 40k as a whole. In 8th and 9th edition, no more. That was gone. And they did receive a few surprising benefits from 8th and 9th edition. So obviously, the new save system made them, interestingly enough, far more survivable. Orks have never been famous for having a particularly good save, but now they actually have an armor save against more weapons than they ever have before. The new army special rules, rather than universal special rules, work much better with Orks, as they never really clicked with the USRs, and the fact that their own special rules are designed to complement and strengthen the Codex, rather than trying to find ways for rules that already exist to fit into another army, never really worked, but now they did for a whole new way. And obviously things like their own army special rules, such as the Dakka Dakka, Here We Go, and Mob Rule, were all brand spanking new ideas in some cases, but also older ideas that were updated and worked better in the 8th and 9th edition system than they ever had done in previous editions. And the fact that they were leaning more into what make Orks unique in this edition really benefited them. As I said in that video, the fact that every codex can now be written to feel unique, and obviously means that every army will now not just play uniquely, but feel uniquely and look uniquely. They won't suddenly feel like it's the same armies, just with cosmetic differences. And then obviously the Orc clans were better than they had ever been. There was actually very rarely a point in the past where the Orc clans were ever represented in gameplay. There was a brief period way back in the 3rd edition codex where they did have Orc clans, but by the time 4th edition rolled around, that was unfortunately gone. And then in both 5th and 6th edition, we did not see the return of the clans at all. But now that they are back, and that's something which is definitely worth celebrating, Psychic Awakening obviously gave us a slew of new stratagems and the subcultures, and obviously a brand new Ghazghkull model, which benefited them immensely. And as the years have gone by for Orks, things have become to look more and more promising, and with the latest release of the Snagger Boys being a completely new idea on the Orks as a whole, it's going to be very interesting to see where all that leads them. So, to conclude, and to surmise in a way, Orks have had a very, very long journey from their early years in 40k, and it's fair to say that they've very much been on a journey on their own terms and in their own way. Unlike the Imperial Guard, whose glorious days were about 10-15 years ago and have been slowly declining ever since. Unlike the Chaos Marines, who have had to work surprisingly hard to stay relevant, but are starting to fragment now as things like Death Guard and Thousand Suns codexes come around. And especially unlike Dark Eldar, who were practically forgotten before roaring back in the early years of 5th edition and have gone from strength to strength ever since. The Orks have had their ups and their downs, but they've always been there. rare, and they've always been quite unique in what they offer to both people who are interested in playing them and those playing against them. There were definitely periods where they were more overbalanced one way or the other, but ultimately I think it's fair to say now that Orks are in a good place. And I say that with one qualification. Orks are in a good place now, largely because in the past they were in such a bad place for such a long time in 6th edition right through 7th edition. Now, obviously, like I said, that came from an area of neglect that was unfortunate, but it did still happen. And for Orc players who remember that time, it's very easy even now to think of Orks maybe not being where they want to be. And when we used to look at codexes that were weaker in 6th and 7th edition, and the 8th edition iterations, it's easy to even now to feel slightly underpowered, but we are still early into the new edition, and all the codexes are getting updated. Orks are coming soon, so it's possible that their power upgrade is going to come very soon, and it may lead them onto new areas, and it may be the biggest revolution they've had since 2007 and their new codex. I believe it will be. I believe Orc players are in for a massive surprise and in for a massive treat, but who knows what the future truly holds. Anyway, but as always, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about the Orks? Do you think they've been consistently strong for the past 30 years? Do you think they've been consistently weak for the past 30 years? Or do you think there has been some ups and some downs along the way? And ultimately, where do you want to see the Orks go in the future? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So there we go, those are my thoughts on the Orks, and a quick retrospective for us as to how the Orks have changed over the years, and they have changed quite a lot since the early 1980s. They've been around for a while, so naturally you'd expect lots of changes, but the changes they have undergone have been pretty big, and how they'll continue to change in the future will be quite interesting. But let me know what you guys think below. As always, whilst you're down there, like, comment, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. The videos are as ever posted on Wednesdays and Fridays, so keep an eye out below. Thank you all very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.